Hello, everybody. Go ahead and turn to Mark chapter 10. Everyone feel good? Are you sitting where the fan's hitting you? If not, you should make better decisions and get to where the fan's hitting you. So we're going to pick up, obviously, just where we left off last week, but this is a story of blind Bartimaeus, and this will we'll close out chapter 10, but it's it's a shorter passage, and it's in a lot of ways very simple, but it's been a very rich study. So hopefully you've had a chance to read over it, but I think we'll all be encouraged by the passage tonight. I'm going to go ahead and read it, and then we'll dive in. It says, "And they came to Jericho. And as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a great crowd, Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, 'Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me.' And many rebuked him, telling him to be silent. But he cried out all the more, 'Son of David, have mercy on me.' And Jesus stopped and said, 'Call him.' And they called the blind man, saying to him, 'Take heart, get up, he is calling you.' And throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And Jesus said to him, 'What do you want me to do for you?' And the blind man said to him, 'Rabbi, let me recover my sight.' And Jesus said to him, 'Go your way. Your faith has made you well.' And immediately he recovered his sight and followed him on the way." And so we've seen throughout Mark's gospel plenty of healing situations, these miracles where Jesus is healing a physical ailment. And it's awesome because really back in chapter 8, we had another blind person healed. Remember, that was the two-stage healing where Jesus first heals them, and then he says, "I see people, but they look like trees walking around." And if you remember, we said that was Jesus was teaching his disciples a lesson. It was this idea of that, like, their understanding of who he is and what he had come to accomplish was still fuzzy. There still needed to be clarity brought to their understanding and to their faith. And so really this story with the blind person being healed in chapter 8 form these bookends in Mark where he's been really highlighting, okay, what does it really look like to be a disciple? He's been teaching that, especially here right up to this point. He's been honing in on what does it look like to be a true Christian or a true disciple. And we should use those terms together because you can't be a true Christian without being a disciple, right? That to put your faith and trust in Christ is to follow him. And so he's been teaching them that, along with what he's been emphasizing in this section is that he's come and he's come to be their king and be their Messiah, but not in the way that they expect. He's come to suffer. He's come to lay down his life. And that all kind of comes to a head here with this last healing miracle in Mark's gospel, the healing of blind Bartimaeus. So we've said in plenty of these stories where we come to these healings that the healing in of itself is awesome, right? It's a miracle. And it's Jesus entering into this really cool moment with somebody that Jesus is personal. He sees them, he heals them, he loves that individual, and that's awesome, and that's not to be downplayed. But what we've tried to emphasize is there's always something much bigger going on than just Jesus healing the temporary effects of living in a fallen and sinful world, right? Because that's why Bartimaeus is blind. Not necessarily because of his own personal sin, but just living in a fallen world that's under the curse and the dominion of sin. That's why there's blindness or lameness or why people die to begin with. why somebody would be deaf or mute or oppressed or even possessed by a demon. Why would they need healing? Why would they need deliverance? Because we live in a fallen world. And so what we've seen throughout Jesus' ministry is that when he's coming along and he's performing these miracles, he's rolling back the effects of sin. To what end? Yeah, for that moment, for that individual in history, and it's a great story, and we can see, there's divine power at work here, but more than that, everything is always pointing to the ultimate miracle that he'll perform, the ultimate deliverance that he'll provide, and that's the miracle of saving souls, delivering somebody not just from physical blindness, but from spiritual blindness. Not just from physically dying, but delivering somebody from an eternal death. If you remember, back when we did our study in Luke, this is from Luke chapter 4, verses 18 and 19. This is when Jesus starts his ministry. He says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, and to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Remember, Jesus does at the beginning of his ministry, and they're all kind of freaking out, like, who is he claiming to be? Because that's a messianic passage. And then it's interesting because throughout Jesus' ministry, everything he's doing screams, this is God. This is the Son of God. This is the Son of Man. This is the Messiah. But anytime somebody else recognized that and began to proclaim it, what would Jesus tell them to do? What would he tell them to do, class? Just like you, be quiet, right? Yeah, like he wouldn't allow them to proclaim it, whether it was a demon recognizing this is the Son of God, or it was somebody that he healed saying, man, this has got to be the Messiah. This has got to be the one that we've been waiting for. And Jesus would always, like time out, pause, don't tell anybody that yet. And we looked at that earlier in Mark, where for his ultimate plan and purpose of building up to where we're coming now in the study of Mark. When at the end of our passage tonight, Jesus is ready to unveil himself that, yes, I am the Messiah. I am the King of Kings. And so, it says this in verse 46, and they came to Jericho. Excuse me for 1 second. I don't want to cough into the mic again. And so, Mark doesn't tell us this part of the story, but Luke does, where Jesus is already in Jericho in the passage that we read. And Luke tells us he comes into Jericho, and that's where he meets and calls and then saves Zacchaeus, and we get that story. And at the end of that story in Luke's gospel is one of the most important phrases that he says, the Son of Man came to give his life as a ransom for many, that he came to seek and to save the lost. And so he has that interaction with Zacchaeus, but he's traveling through Jericho, ultimately on his way to Jerusalem. Now, this was really common. And so in our passage, it's already told us that Jesus is leaving Jericho with his disciples, but also with this huge crowd. And this was very common because this is the time, they're coming up on the time of Passover. And so all of Israel would be traveling to Jerusalem. And if you were coming from the north, which most of the Jews lived in the north at this time, you would come by and you would stop in Jericho, because it was on the way almost where they would come down kind of through a desert area, tracking alongside the Jordan River. But then as they got close, people would peel off. And this isn't Jericho like Joshua marched around the walls of Jericho and then they came tumbling down. That city didn't exist at this point, but not far away, they've rebuilt Jericho. Herod actually rebuilt Jericho because this one spot was an oasis. There was palm trees, there was plenty of good water, and it was an awesome place to stop on the way to Jerusalem. So for most families, if they were traveling from different areas, it was just understood, all right, we're going to head down to Jerusalem for the Passover, and we'll meet in Jericho, resupply, rest a little bit, and then head up to Jerusalem. And it always says up to Jerusalem because really, no matter where you're coming from, if you're going to Jerusalem, you're gaining a lot in the way of elevation. So from Jericho to Jerusalem, it's you gain almost, it's like 3,700 feet of elevation. I went outside earlier and eyeballed from the parking lot, looking up at Joanna Bald, the where you can see the cell phone towers from here, and that's about the elevation gain that we're talking about. So you can look at that after. I didn't really eyeball it. I asked Brody, I was like, hey, what around here would you gain about, almost 4,000 feet of elevation? And he knew, which is why I asked him. And so, but it's pretty substantial. And so this is not an easy hike. And so they're fixing to leave Jericho and make that hike. And so they're leaving town. But because Jericho was so situated and because it really was an oasis, obviously there's lots of travel through there, lots of commerce. And so Bartimaeus has his spot. This is a good place for a blind beggar to stop and to ask for help. But then he hears that this isn't just a crowd coming by, that Jesus is with them. That Jesus is with them. Verse 47. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And many rebuked him, telling him to be silent, but he cried out all the more. So he knows it's Jesus, and we're not given the backstory of, has he heard Jesus preach? Was he there when the whole Zacchaeus thing went down? We don't know. All we know is that he recognizes that this is Jesus, and he calls out, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. He just begins to scream out for mercy, for salvation, for deliverance. He knows, okay, this is the one who can heal me. So I want to pause right here because I said earlier, Jesus has been teaching his disciples what a true disciple looks like. And we've just left the passage where Jesus has called them out. Because do you remember? James and John approached Jesus, and it's kind of mind-blowing because they approach Jesus and they say, they kick off the conversation with, we want you to do whatever we ask of you. I mean, awesome. I mean, my kids aren't even that bold. I want you to get me whatever I ask for my birthday. That's just what I want you to do, Dad. Okay, that's going to go great. I'm going to say no just on principle. But they're bold, man. They go to Jesus. They're like, before we even ask you, we want you to say yes. And Jesus, remember, he asked them a question. He says, what do you want me to do for you? All right, now, if they weren't already, little bells should be going off in your head. Not like angels got a wing bells, but I just heard that phrase a second ago bell, right? He says, what do you want me to do for you? And they say, we want to sit one on your right, one on your left when you come into your kingdom. He's just told them, man, I'm going to Jerusalem to die. And they're like, man, we want to sit on either side of you in your kingdom. What are they asking for? We want power. We want a position of authority and honor and prestige. And Jesus says, man, don't you get it? Don't you get it? If you desire to be first, you're going to be last. My disciple is one who looks out for who's last and serves them. And so when we flow right into this passage, what we're getting is Jesus is being set up by Mark as Jesus is the example of what it means to serve. But now Bartimaeus is also being set up as an example of what does a real disciple look like? What does it look like to be a follower of Christ, to be a Christian? He cried out all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And Jesus stopped and said, "Call him." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." And throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And Jesus said to him, "Here we go. Here's our question. What do you want me to do for you?" And the blind man said to him, "Rabbi, let me recover my sight." So all he's been doing is calling out, "Have mercy on me, have mercy on me, have mercy on me." And Jesus says, okay, and his disciples are around him, "What do you want me to do for you?" "Just make me whole. Just show me mercy. Deliver me from this blindness." He's just throwing himself at the grace and the mercy of Jesus. He doesn't come saying, "I want you to do whatever I ask, just go ahead and say yes." He just pleads his grace and his mercy and asks to be healed. I'll pause here. So I used this illustration with students this past winter, which right now feels so far away because I cannot feel the fan. And I almost shouldn't use this illustration, but maybe if we use our imaginations enough, maybe it'll just take down, like, even if it's 1 degree, it'd be worth it. But so I use this illustration where, if you're familiar with the Chronicles of Narnia, and the first book in that series, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, great story, loved reading it to my kids. I've used them in sermons a bunch. But in that story, the whole premise is, right, that there's this magical land of Narnia that was created by this creature, Aslan, but it's been since taken over, and the creatures of that land are oppressed by this white witch. And part of that oppression is that she's made it, and here it is, go there in your mind, it's always winter and never Christmas, which for them is a bad thing, right? Like, always winter, never Christmas. And so, like, the rivers are frozen, nothing's growing, it's just cold all the time, and she just makes them her slaves. And then, of course, in the story, you have these 4 human children from our world that magically find their way into Narnia. And as they begin to move through Narnia, they learn, from a talking beaver, of course, they learn that they're there to, like, fulfill this prophecy. And while they're there, like, they start to see the effects that, like, okay, something is happening, something's changing. And they keep hearing these creatures say, Aslan is on the move. And for C.S. Lewis, in these stories, Aslan it's an analogy, it's a picture, it's a type of Jesus. That Aslan is on the move. And you can see that because in the story, the river begins to thaw. And the snow begins to melt. And the white witch who goes around on a sled can't get around on the sled anymore because there's no more snow. And by the end of it, it's like springtime, and Aslan is there in full authority to deliver them from the evil witch. And I think that's what stories like this are. Like, yes, Jesus loved this dude, and he came to rescue him, but there's more going on when he's healing him of his blindness. Like, he's showing, he's undoing the curse. That's why he came. The snow's melting, the river's thawing. Why? Because Jesus is on the move. And Jesus is nearing Jerusalem now, and it's towards the end of his ministry, and he's showing one more time, okay, this is what I came to do. I came to seek and to save the lost, and what that's going to look like in his ministry is the blind will receive their sight. Why? He's undoing the power and the curse of sin. So when he says to Bartimaeus, Jesus said to him, "Go your way, your faith has made you well." And immediately he recovered his sight and followed him on the way. It says, your faith has made you well. Again, this is the physical healing is an illustration of the spiritual salvation that Bartimaeus has received. And what's fascinating to me in studying this. The word that's used here where it says, your faith has made you well, the word made well, and it's the same word that was used when Jesus healed the woman who had the issue of blood. She's made whole. It's the same word as when Jesus said that he could rescue and heal Jairus' daughter. It's the same word that was used when he restored the man who had the withered hand, that being made well or being made whole. But it's also the same word that Jesus uses for saved, to be delivered. In fact, from this point on, like in Mark 16, verse 16, Jesus says, whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned. But not just in Mark's gospel, it's really throughout the New Testament that this word is used either way, depending on the context. So in Acts 2:21, it says, this is Peter's sermon on Pentecost, and it shall come to pass that everyone who calls upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. Romans 10:9 and 10, familiar passage. Because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart one believes and is justified, and with the mouth one confesses and is saved. So why do I make a big deal about that? I don't often do word studies, especially when looking at one word and tracing it all over the Bible. I think you can get in trouble doing that, but I think it's not incidental that Jesus uses this word. I think we're supposed to feel the weight of it is the same. So what happened when he says to Bartimaeus, your faith has made you well or whole? Is he talking about his soul or his physical eyes? Yes, both. D, all the above. Yeah, I think we're supposed to see this. He has healed his physical eyes as a living illustration of what he's done for his soul. And what he's clearly done for his soul is saved him. He's made him whole. He's rescued him. And that becomes evident because he does what a Christian does. He does what a true disciple is meant to do. Do you see it? He used to be the blind beggar on the side of the road, and now he's a disciple in the road. And Jesus says to him, go your way. Your faith has made you well. Your faith has saved you. And which way does Bartimaeus go? Wherever Jesus is going, he follows him. Do you see it? He followed Jesus on the way. He'll follow him wherever he goes, even if it means walking all the way up to Jerusalem, to the cross. He'll follow Jesus because that's who a disciple is. That's what a Christian does. He follows Jesus. R.C. Sproul points this out. He says, what I find fascinating about the blind man's appeal was the soundness of his theology. Without eyes to see, he knew who was coming, the Messiah, the long-promised deliverer of Israel, who would come out of the family and lineage of David, who would be David's greater son, who would restore the kingship to David, who would be David's son, yet at the same time, David's Lord. One of the richest, most pregnant messianic titles in all of the Old Testament is the title Son of David. And so what's this contrast that we have with the 12, where they're looking at Jesus and not quite seeing clearly. Jesus, they want to fight over position and honor and prestige. They're not seeing clearly, what does it mean that Jesus is the Son of Man? What does it mean that he's the suffering servant of Isaiah? What does it mean that he's the Son of David? And what Bartimaeus sees more clearly with 2 blind eyes and the 24 combined healthy eyes of the disciples is, this is him. This is him. This is the one that we've been waiting for. And if this is the one we've been waiting for, he can save me. He can open up my physical eyes, and he can open up the eyes of my soul. And that's exactly what happens. Son of David, have mercy on me. It's the only time it's used in Mark, this title for Jesus. And I think he saves it for this moment to emphasize what previously Jesus had been asking everyone to keep under wraps. The Messiah has come. Because now, unlike before, where he's trying to keep the crowds from getting the wrong idea of what the Messiah would be, trying to take him by force to make him king, now he's ready to unveil that he is the Messiah because he's going into Jerusalem. And the title, Son of David, and pointing to his messianic claims makes sense because what chapter 11 opens up with, and what we'll see next week, is the crowds begin to recognize this is the Messiah as they cry out, Hosanna. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. But I want to point out just a few points of application, and we'll be done. I think he stands out as an awesome example of what a disciple is, primarily in this. He cries out for Jesus' mercy, and Jesus stops in his grace. He stops and he says, call him. And this part of the story is kind of humorous, right? Where, at least in my mind, the way it plays out is he finds out that Jesus is coming, but he's still a long way off. But he doesn't know that. And so he just starts shouting, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me, over and over and over again. And everybody around him has had enough, right? Bart, give it a rest. We'll let you know when he's within, like, shouting distance, like, just chill, dude. Quit screaming in my ear. So, quick story. I guess, I don't know, I was probably 10 years old. I think it was when, I was probably about 10 years old because it was when the first Bush was running for president. And I remember my mom was so excited. My whole family was excited because Ronald Reagan was going to be at this event to speak on behalf, like he's championing Bush. And so they were like, man, we got to go hear Reagan. And I was like, I'm 10, so I'm going. And all I remember is, it must have been summertime because it was just wicked hot. And we'd had a quick breakfast. I remember my mom gave me donuts and orange juice. That's all I'd had. And we go and we tried to get there early to get as close to the stage as possible. But then it was just this crowd of people descended. And all I remember, I'm 10, and so I was shorter than I am now. And you think, never mind. I know what you think. And all I remember was my vantage point was not awesome, if you know what I'm saying. I'm a 10-year-old short kid, and I'm in this crowd, and we're all pressed in, and I just remember so hot, sweating, and it felt like this joker is never going to walk out on stage. And I remember looking at my mom being like, I'm going to be sick. I'm going to be sick. And for good reason, she didn't believe me. She was like, you're going to be fine, you're going to be fine. You just want to get out of the heat. And I was like, I'm going to be sick. And at some point, she looked down at me, and I must have changed colors. And I remember she was like, she grabbed my hand. I could see the panic in her eye, and I was like, it's coming. And she starts trying to move me through that crowd, and she's going, excuse me, my son is sick. And people are just like, they're not giving an inch because everyone's there to see, at least for that demographic, their favorite president ever. And no one's giving an inch until. And all I remember is I tried to get my hand up in time. If you get queasy easy, don't listen to this part. And all I remember is I got my hand up to about right here, but my fingers just acted like, it just sent everything in very precise directions. And I remember seeing this lady was wearing white and her dress just going whoosh, not with the wind. But all of a sudden, the crowd, it parted like the Red Sea. And we walked through on dry ground. And all of a sudden, people found room. And we got through, and I just think, man, was it like that, where it's like the crowd is pressed in, like people are traveling with Jesus, there's so many people, and this guy's like, because all it was for me was one guy went, sick kid, and everyone went, zoom, and he's yelling out, Son of David, and everyone's getting just annoyed with him, no, man, shut up, move back, we all want to see Jesus, we all have something we want him to do for us, and they just don't want to listen, but finally, he's crying out, Son of David, Son of David, Son of David, have mercy on me, and Jesus stops, and he says, call him. And I love this moment right here, because Jesus could have gone to him, he could have sent his disciples just to go get him, but he said, call him. He includes us in his work. I love this moment. They get those jokers, and whether it's the same ones and they just turn on a dime and they go from shut up Bart to oh hey Bart, let's go to see Jesus together. I'll take you. Come on, buddy. And get up to Jesus this is my friend. Did you say it was Bart? Bartimaeus. This is my good buddy Bartimaeus. I'd like to introduce you. Maybe the three of us could hang out. And he's like, man, get out of here. And whatever happened, Jesus includes them in his ministry. It's an awesome moment, but for Bartimaeus, it's just simple faith. This is the one who can heal me. This is the one who can save me. And he follows him wherever he goes. And so for us, men, I don't know. Some of you have been Jesus has been calling you. He's been sending people to you saying, hey, get up, come to Jesus. And you've pushed back on that. Whether you think, man, I'll just someday, some point, sometime, as if you're in control of the moments of your life. And I would encourage you, man, respond like Zacchaeus, but also like Bartimaeus. Man, just come to Christ. Come to Christ. A true disciple is one who says, take heart, rise, he's calling you. The simplicity of Bartimaeus' faith is our example. He seeks mercy from Jesus. He obeys him immediately and follows him wherever he goes. One commentator said, Jesus has transformed Bartimaeus from a beggar beside the road to a disciple on the road. Faith that does not lead to discipleship is not saving faith. Whoever asks of Jesus must be willing to follow Jesus, even on the uphill road to the cross. So I want to close by reading, I didn't know that the guys were going to sing this at the beginning, but it was perfect timing. I want to read from John Newton's hymn, Amazing Grace, just the first two stanzas, and then I'll close in prayer. It says, Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, in grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear, the hour I first believed. Pray with me. Lord, love you, and thank you for the gospel. Thank you for your salvation. God, I pray that you would draw men and women to yourself. God, that you would give them the courage to jump up, to leap up, and to run to you, to call out for your mercy, to be rescued by you. Lord, I pray for us as believers that we would see the privilege we have as telling other people that you're calling them to take the message and the hope of the gospel to the lost, that they too can have their eyes opened and see that you are the King of Kings, that you are the Son of Man, that you are the Son of God. Lord, I pray that as we go into this time of worship, that you would be exalted, that you would be lifted high, and that you would receive the praise of your people. And pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.